merely hanging on the cross, and 2, hanging on the cross resulting in death. How do we know that Jesus hung on the cross until he died? John Rousseau and Rami Araf, in their book entitled Jesus and His World, a Cultural and Archaeological Dictionary, tells us that crucifixion can take several days to kill a person. In fact, the whole purpose of crucifixion as an execution, as a method of execution, was to result in a slow and agonizing death. Now, we have it in the Gospels that Jesus was crucified at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then he died by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That means only 6 hours. So if crucifixion often took several days to kill a person, how did Jesus die only after a few hours? When Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate to ask for permission to remove Jesus' body from the cross to give him a decent burial, Pilate, the Roman governor, according to Mark's Gospel, marveled that Jesus could have died so soon. And when he asked for confirmation from the centurion, he was given that confirmation, and this is when he released the body. Pilate initially had some doubt, which was removed on the confirmation of the centurion. Matthew and Luke base their narratives on Mark's Gospel, but they do not mention that Pilate has had this doubt. Raymond Brown, in his 2-volume work entitled The Death of the Messiah, theorizes that Matthew and Luke did not mention the doubt of Pilate because they did not want readers of their Gospels to have the same doubt. Naturally, when you hear that Pilate had the doubt, you might be thinking, oh yeah, how did he die so soon? So those who were reading Mark's Gospel are coming away with the same question. And Matthew and Luke, writing independently, circulating their Gospels in different areas, did not want their readers to have the same doubt, so they omitted this mention. But now we can ask again, what was the cause of Jesus' death? Raymond Brown, again in his 2-volume work, says that we must ask, what was the physiological cause of the death of Jesus, since crucifixion pierces no vital organ? Now, we do know that there are ways in which people might be thought to be dead, but that are not really dead. Sometimes a person goes into a coma and then for no apparent reason wakes up to the surprise of everyone. In fact, this is not only a new phenomenon, but it is quite old. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, Paul was stoned to death by the Jews. They dragged him out of the city limits and left him to death. They left him, presuming him dead. But as soon as they left the scene, Paul got up and walked away. So they thought he was dead, but he wasn't dead. Some may think that the Roman soldiers must have been expert executioners, and they would have certainly be sure that Jesus died before they left him alone. But a few points need to be considered here. First of all, Roman centurions are still human beings. Brian Innes, in his book Death and the Afterlife, speaks about certain conditions where a person may go into a state of suspended animation. And in that case, even qualified medical doctors of our present time may be fooled. Such a state of suspended animation may be brought on by, for example, the overdose of certain narcotic drugs. When the drugs wear off, the person may come back to an animated state, not having died in the first place, but appearing to have died. Constance Jones, in the book R.I.P., the complete book of death and dying, also informs us that mistakes have been made in the past as they are being made now. Sometimes people presumed dead actually are not really dead, though, again, qualified people might be fooled. What about in the time of Jesus? John Bondison, in the book Buried Alive, tells us that Pliny, the Roman historian, Pliny the Younger, writing from the time of the early Christian centuries, expresses his own pessimism, and it says that the human condition is such that we cannot even tell the difference between death and life. So often does it occur that a living person is presumed to have died. So then, when one looked at Jesus and he was on the cross, how did one know that he was actually dead? Did anyone test his pulse? Did anyone listen for a heartbeat? Obviously, the modern medical equipment was not even available, so we need not ask if anyone used a stethoscope or a electrocardiogram or an electroencephalogram. We just could understand that at the time, some primitive methods might have been used to determine death. But if we ask even about these primitive methods, were they used? How could Jesus' pulse be tested when in fact he was there on the cross? Now, if the Roman soldiers and others there at the foot of the cross look up and say, okay, he's dead, what makes them think he's dead? This is just a presumption. Well, the presumption might have been normally sufficient, because if a person had been crucified, he had been left there to hang for several hours, and now he is taken down, and if he's put in a shallow grave, then eventually the birds and the vultures, the dogs and other rodents and so on, would devour his body. So he does not really stand a chance at survival. Crucifixion was such that hardly anyone might be expected to survive. But it seems that Jesus went through some unique circumstances. If one was to be taken down from the cross early, I have 5 minutes more. If one were to be taken down early from the cross, his legs might be broken. There are two theories about why his legs might be broken. One is that there is an idea that when the victim's body sags, he suffocates on the carbon dioxide in his lungs. In order to exhale the carbon dioxide, he has to straighten up his body and take a good breath. But if his body sags, that's the end of him. Now, by breaking his legs, that guarantees that his body will sag. That's one theory. But it seems that some others dispute that theory. And Frederick Zugibe, in his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, A Forensic Inquiry, is one of those who disputes that theory. He thinks that the breaking of the legs was to ensure that if he was put in a tomb, he would not be able to crawl out of the tomb even if he was alive. This again shows that there is a possibility that the crucified person might be taken down alive, but the general expectation is that no matter what, taken down alive or dead, eventually that will be the end of him. You break his legs, put him in a tomb, you may as well forget about the man. It turns out, however, that the legs of Jesus were not broken according to John's Gospel. Jesus was crucified along with two other persons. The Roman soldiers came and broke the legs of the one, bypassed Jesus, broke the legs of the other, and when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and therefore they did not bother to break his legs. The John's Gospel says that one of the Roman soldiers nevertheless pierced his side with a spear, and one might hope that this would have been the physiological cause of Jesus' death. However, many historians think that this act of spearing the side of Jesus is not a historical reminiscence, but this is an apologetic motif in John's Gospel. John, they say, introduced this for a number of reasons. One, to prove finally that Jesus died. If we were to ask, therefore, what in the other three Gospels would assure us that Jesus died, in the first three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is nothing really to guarantee that Jesus actually died. So minus this spear thrust, what would have killed Jesus? And since this spear thrust is not to be taken as a historical fact, but only a theological embellishment of the facts, then we do not have anything that would have definitively killed Jesus. What might have happened to Jesus then? If Jesus was taken down alive, which is what appears to have happened, and placed in that airy chamber, Jesus may have been translated to heaven directly from the tomb. In fact, it is known now that some early Christians did have the idea that Jesus was translated into heaven, taken from the tomb straight up into heaven, in which case he did not come out of the tomb and appear to his disciples and then ascend to heaven, but first he ascended to heaven, and if he did at all appear to his disciples, it would have been after his initial ascent into heaven. We have evidence of this in the document that has been reconstructed from Matthew and Luke, the document that scholars refer to as the Gospel Q. The gospel cue speaks about the sign of Jonah, and it says nothing about there being a time factor, nothing about 3 days and 3 nights. The idea about 3 days and 3 nights is in Matthew's gospel, chapter 12, verse 40. But when we look at the Q document reconstructed, it's only about the sign of Jonah. So what was the sign of Jonah? It seems clear that the sign of Jonah was that Jonah was preserved alive in the belly of the whale, and Jesus likewise is going to be preserved alive, even though the enemies of Jesus had attempted to kill him, just like those had attempted to kill Jonah in the first place. If Jesus was translated into heaven then, Muslims should have no difficulty in thinking that Jesus was again made to appear to his disciples in order to assure his disciples that he was alive with God. In fact, Raymond Brown thinks that all of the narratives which we have looked at in the gospel showing that Jesus appeared to his disciples again actually originated from a singular narrative showing that on one occasion Jesus appeared to his disciples in a general way, not in the way depicted in Luke's gospel where he is felt and touched and where he's poked. But it might have been something like a spiritual appearance, and I don't believe that Muslims have any difficulty with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabir, and thank you, Manfred, for that time out. Once again, I reiterate the importance of these discussions because these are not issues that Muslims would hear in mosques or Christians would necessarily hear in churches. So it's good that we can meet together and share different ideas. I now call upon John Gilchrist to address us for 35 minutes.
It's a privilege being with you this evening, and being able to share this symposium and debate with you, Shabir, getting to know you and getting to like you. Real privilege having him here from Canada, where my younger son is at the moment. And I think he brought a bit of Toronto's weather with you this last 2 days because it's been freezing here. But really good to share this platform with you again. I'm only going to touch on what the Quran teaches about the crucifixion of Jesus briefly. Shabir went into it. There's only one verse in the Quran, or one little short passage that actually deals with it. And all it says is, they did not kill him, they did not crucify him. A very emphatic statement in Arabic, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. But so it was made to appear to them. وَلَكِنْ شُبِهَ لَهُمْ. And then it says that there are many people who are full of doubts and full of conjectures. They have no knowledge about the subject. They only conjecture to follow. But verily, he was not crucified, but Allah raised him up to himself. Now, I'm not quite sure what the Quran is actually telling me actually happened to Jesus. It denies outright that Jesus was either crucified or killed, which tells me that the Quranic basis of this narrative is that he was never put on the cross at all. But if I ask myself then what actually happened to him, I'm not sure. I find it actually rather a strange sort of contrast that while the Quran on the one side says a lot of people are full of doubts and conjectures, that's all they follow, and yet if that was the case, and if we Christians were wrong in believing that Jesus had actually been crucified and resurrected, and if Allah is the author of the Quran, I would have expected a very clear statement in the Quran to say this is exactly what happened to Jesus. But the statement, so it was made to appear to them, I find vague in the extreme. Muslim people have generally believed that somebody else was made to look like Jesus, that person was crucified in his place, Jesus was taken alive to God to be saved from his enemies, and that was how it appeared to them. But the Quran doesn't actually say that. It just says, so it was made to appear to them, and leaves it there. And it leaves me really with no light or insight at all as to what actually happened. Shabir said that you need independent evidence of some sort to the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, when it comes to this very subject, you have to ask yourself what sort of evidence you're looking for. With the Titanic, when that sank many years ago in 1912, the only evidence that they had was the testimony of the survivors. There was no sign of the ship, fair enough, but who knows? Why didn't some Somali pirates perhaps hijack it and take it down to Bermuda? Why didn't perhaps the White Star Line orchestrate the sinking of the ship to claim insurance? Any number of explanations could have been given. All they knew was the ship had gone. There was no sign of it. But nobody photographed it sinking. Nobody saw it. It just happened. And all they had to rely on was a testimony of 770-odd witnesses who said the Titanic had actually sunk. But the reaction of those witnesses, they were found on lifeboats, they were cold, they were wet, the women were shattered, they'd lost their husbands, they'd lost all their possessions. These people expected to be in New York in a day or two, after a comfortable ride on the best ocean liner in the world, and here they were absolutely abandoned, just battling to survive, just one night being exposed on these boats. So their testimony became crucial. And yet even then there were some differences among them. Shabir came out and said, look, the differences between Matthew and Luke and differences between John and others, and sort of quoted a whole number of them. Well, there were differences between the Titanic witnesses as well. Some of them said that the last song that the band played, because it was known to be playing on, was Autumn. But other witnesses said, no, the last song they played was Nearer, My God, to Thee. And then others said, well, Murdoch, the first officer of Titanic, shot himself. One or two of the witnesses said that. And the rest said, no, we're not aware of that. The biggest contradiction between them was that the bulk of them, about 700 of them, said that the Titanic had gone down smoothly in one piece. It just simply went down by the bow, it simply rose in the air, and it slid beneath the waters. But there were a number of witnesses who contradicted that, and they said, no, the Titanic broke in two on the surface and then went down in two pieces down to the bottom of the ocean. Well, the Border Trade, or the inquiry that went afterwards, rejected that interpretation. They said that's a minority of witnesses, sounds highly improbable. So they said, no, the Titanic went down in one piece. So all you had there to go by was just the testimony of witnesses. And it's the same with the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus, particularly the resurrection, because Jesus deliberately did not show himself to anybody but the people who had already believed in him before his resurrection. Showed himself, all four Gospels consistently show that he manifested himself only to those who already believed in him. He was not one for going and making a show of himself. As you know from John 7, I think it is, that when his brothers said to him, leave here, go to Jerusalem, show your disciples the work that you are doing, Jesus refused to do so. He would not go up publicly, he only went in private. And it was not his intention ever. Whenever people tried to make him king, he just simply withdrew into the shadows. It was not his intention to make a public spectacle of himself. But at this particular time, with the disciples of Jesus here, having seen the resurrected Jesus, only they can give us the evidence we need, the really independent evidence, just like the people who were on the Titanic. And the thing is, those evidences are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also in the book of Acts. But one of the difficulties we have today is that we're sitting 2,000 years past the event. And it's very easy to sit down and look at the different narratives, and I just say different in the terms of contrast. That's how I see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Virtually everything I heard that Shabir said here to me, I just kept thinking to myself, contrast, contrast, contrast. Different writers putting their own perspective, their own awareness of what happened, confining themselves to perhaps the evidences they know, and then defining them. Now, with the Titanic, it was different. We can't invite back Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the authors of the Gospel, and say, now exactly what did you mean? Why did you say this if the other Gospel writer said that? We might be very surprised to find how easily they harmonize or explain to us exactly why they wrote the way they did. But with the Titanic, it was different. They were able to call the witness back. In 1985, Dr. Bob Ballard found the Titanic down at the bottom of the ocean. And everybody's surprised, what had they found? It was broken in two pieces, just as the minority of the witnesses had said. In fact, it was so badly broken in two pieces that the two parts were about half a mile apart. In fact, the front of the ship, the bow was facing one way and the stern was facing the other. And this stunned them, and they said, how could this have happened? So they did forensic tests on it and said, how could this event have occurred? And what they found was that the ship had to have broken on the surface. That was the only way it could have happened. And when they looked at this, they said, well, what do we do? What do you say about 700 people out of 770 who insisted that the Titanic had gone down in one piece? Well, when they looked at it more carefully, they they found that what the Titanic had obviously done, and if you've seen James Cameron's film, you'll get this, is that it had snapped. As it was going, the weight at the back snapped. But the keel didn't break off entirely, so that although the ship was now clearly broken in two pieces, keel was still connected and pulled the back part down. And as it went down, it broke. And the front part went this way and the back part went that way. And in that sense, everybody was telling the truth. But nobody could have guessed that at the time. At the time, the first inquiry said, no, these people who say it broke in two are talking nonsense. The Board of Inquiry said, no way, that's a contradiction. But finally, when evidence was discovered and brought back right to us and say, that's it, that's how the ship lies at the bottom of the ocean, they were able to understand why. People at a distance from the Titanic on a dark night said it went down in one piece, but those who were closer said it went down in two. It's not contradictory evidence of witnesses. It's a different perspective depending on what the witness sees, where he is, what he experiences at particular times. And the same it was here with the disciples. But what is the witness of the disciples of Jesus? Because they're the only ones who could really confirm the resurrection. Now, I look at them carefully and I say that if Jesus had survived the cross, if he had come down from the cross alive, then I would not expect to be finding him walking around in perfect health 2 days later. I can assure you that if you were crucified on a Friday and you went taken off the cross after 6 hours, after having been scourged by Pontius Pilate, after having not had a night's sleep, struck and put a crown of thorns on your head which made you bleeding, and left to die in agony on a cross and brought down to all intents and purposes with everybody viewing it, because nobody there doubted that Jesus was dead. I could not expect to find a person walking around like the gardener in perfect health 2 days later. But that's exactly what happens. I'd expect to find the person was, just so weak that they would have had to look after him, massaged him, and, salved him. They didn't have the medication we have today. I would also have expected the disciples to have been shattered. I would have expected them, as they did, to go running away, hiding in the shadows, never to come out again and just go back to their businesses in Galilee and say, well, this has all come to nothing. And that, in fact, is what Rabbi Gamaliel said to the Jewish council some time later, when these disciples kept going out into Jerusalem boldly proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And the council wasn't sure, but they wanted to punish them, they wanted to beat them, kill them, whatever. And they couldn't understand that these disciples were courting whatever was coming their way. They were quite confident in what they were saying. Rabbi Gamaliel said, he said, take care how you deal with these men. He said, before these days, this is Acts 5:36, before these days, Theudas arose. He was somebody who claimed to be a Messiah, we don't know what, but he claimed to be somebody special. And Rabbi Gamaliel said 400 followers followed him around, but he died. He was put to death, and his disciples were scattered, came to nothing. And so he said the same way, Judas the Galilean in the days of the census, another one pretender, pretending Messiah or whatever, he likewise perished, and everybody was scattered, and it came to nothing. And I would have believed